Hi, everybody. My name is Santiago Lyon. I head up Advocacy and Education on the Content Authenticity Initiative. And I'm going to be spending a few minutes with you talking about the use cases and our progress as it relates to news media and journalism. So we're just getting the chairs set up here. They call these things fireside chats. I don't see a fireside necessarily, but I do feel the warmth. So you guys are the fire, which is great. And that's important because we need to keep this fire burning bright. As Dana and others indicated, our work in this space is critical, never been more important. And it's really amazing to see everybody here today, 150 or so of the world's experts on provenance gathered in one room. Astonishing. Wonderful to be here. So let's sit down and get this thing going. So by way of introduction, my background is in journalism. I spent 20 years as a photographer in the field working for Reuters and the Associated Press news agency, and 10 of those years were spent covering war and conflict around the world. I photographed 9 wars on 4 continents. I was captured by Saddam Hussein's army in the first Gulf War. I was wounded in Bosnia. I lost over a dozen friends to violent deaths as they brought truth to the public around the world. And so my commitment to journalism and to truth and authenticity runs very deep. After that, I became vice president in charge of photography for the Associated Press, overseeing over 1,000 photographers who collectively published 1 million pictures a year telling the world's story, and every one of those pictures was truthful and authentic. So again, this work is, for me, a logical extension of my life's work, and I believe has great value for journalism and for society in general. I'm going to introduce my friend here, David Clinch. David's a remarkable fellow. He started off as a journalist and has sort of transitioned into the intersection of journalism and business. He's a self-described CEO whisperer, which means he gets access to the people at the top of journalism organizations and persuades them to explore new technologies and helps them grow their revenue. He's co-founder and managing director of partnerships at Media Growth Partners, helping media companies grow and measure their audience revenue and impact. And as I mentioned, he worked as an international journalist, in his case at ITN in the UK and then at CNN. He also co-founded Storyful, which was a sort of a clearinghouse for user-generated content, is a clearinghouse for user-generated content. And he's a VP at Mather Economics, where he works partnering with companies across multiple industries. Throughout his 3-decade career at the intersection of news and technology, he's created an unrivaled network and a skill set based on direct experience of both innovative journalism and successful business strategies. So, remarkable fellow, and I'm delighted to be sharing the stage with him today as we spend the next few minutes talking about how this work intersects with the world of journalism. Before I get this going, I wanted to sort of review our progress thus far. You've heard a little bit about it from Dana and others, but generally speaking, we divide our work, at least on the team here, into 3 main areas. We start with the area of capture, and that involves integrating this technology into hardware devices, cameras, smartphones, etc. And we're making really good progress there. Our friends at Leica were the first out of the traps with that. Fantastic. Sony has announced that they will be integrating this technology into their cameras in the early part of next year. Our friends at Nikon, who are here with us today, are busy at work on the 2nd or 3rd edition of their prototype. We're talking to multiple smartphone manufacturers. We're really making good progress on the capture side of things, and that's very encouraging. Our next area is around editing. This technology is already in Photoshop and Lightroom as Adobe products. We're looking at integrating it into other flagship Adobe products, and we're also working with non-Adobe, editing software. Our friends from Camera Bits, who make Photomechanic, are here. Dennis Walker, a remarkably talented fellow with whom I enjoyed a long professional relationship at the Associated Press, is doing great work. And so we feel pretty good about the progress on the editing front. And then the last area that we're really focused on is publishing. And that's really what we're going to talk a little bit about here today. We have multiple news media members of the CAI. I think between organizations and individuals, we have about 500 news media representatives in the CAI. And that's really encouraging. And that, of course, includes the big sort of what you might call wholesalers, the news agencies, the Associated Presses and the Reuters and the AFPs, and many representatives from those organizations are here today, and we welcome you. And then the consumer-facing organizations, the New York Timeses and the Washington Posts and the Wall Street Journals. We have a really good representation across the media ecosystem, and again, many of representatives from those companies are here today. But progress in publishing has been a little bit slower than we've liked, and it has to do with a couple of things that we'll get into in a second. The way that news companies operate, and then the multiple complexities of the publishing process. We're very proud to have here today a representative from Bio Bio in Chile, which is Chile's largest online media site. And the reason that Christian from Bio Bio is here is because they have been the first media company out of the traps to publish content credentials, albeit as a proof of concept, but to publish content credentials on a live media site. And Christian will be showing some of that work in our tech demos this afternoon. So I just wanted to give that overview of that capture, edit, publish, and where we are in each phase. And as you can see, we're making progress. But getting back to the topic at hand here about journalism, David, I wonder from your perspective, what is or what should be the value proposition to the business of journalism as it relates to provenance and authenticity, and how do we accelerate that?
Well, thank you for having me, Santi. And I will say a couple of things. I think Dana mentioned how impressive it is to see all of these tech companies working together, but how difficult that is because of competitive nature of the business. If you think the competitive nature of the tech business is bad, try to get anything instigated or integrated across the news industry, and you are asking for trouble because there's so much competition, there are so many other priorities, so many other things, there are existential threats to the news industry that exist right now. So it is not easy to get news companies to work together and to think about integrating protocols like content credentials, even if everyone recognizes the importance of them and the value of them. And yet, there is, I think, a real opportunity right now because of those existential challenges for those news companies, and again, I talk to a lot of these senior executives all the time, to recognize the fact that if they don't act, if they don't integrate indicators of authenticity and provenance now, they're just making their own problems a lot worse. As AI is both an opportunity and a challenge for the news industry, things like content credentials can be incredibly helpful from a technical perspective. Now, we could talk in a minute about the audience side of that, but from a newsroom perspective, it is incredibly important that editors, newsrooms, the publishers understand how these protocols work and how they translate into the content that they actually publish. And also, I will also say that authenticity and provenance cannot just be buzzwords. They have to translate into value, value for the publishers and value for the audience. And in order for that to happen, they have to be connected to things that are already seen as valuable. If you are spending a lot of time and money publishing your content and expecting people to pay for that, anything and everything that can help you indicate the value of that is important. But provenance actually gets to the deeper value, the kind of value you were talking about in your work as a journalist, my work as a journalist at CNN and at Storyful. If you cannot find a way to make provenance represent the risk, human, physical risk that is sometimes involved in the acquisition of news content. If provenance just means something technical, it doesn't recognize the full value of journalism. People are risking their lives in a politically fraught environment. People are risking their careers. This value is not just a manifest of technical aspects of content. It also has to represent and be part of the story that the news media tells about itself to audiences about provenance being value for them, for society, for the consumers, for journalists. As we start talking to these publishers about what content credentials means and what provenance means, it has to be tied to that kind of storytelling as well.
That makes perfect sense to me. But you've been socializing some of this with senior media executives as part of your general work. Do you get a sense that they're starting to grasp it? Because the dynamic that I've seen over the last 3 years, which involves sort of going around the world, explaining our work in layperson's terms, growing the community, and then working towards implementation, the dynamic that I've seen is I talk regularly, or have talked to the publishers, CEOs of media companies. Their perspective on the world is, as you'd expect, strategic. They see the whole space. They instinctively grasp the value of this. They then push it down into their organizations to the subject matter experts, whether they're technical or journalistic. And that's where things get a little bit gummed up, because those people often have a lot of stuff on their plate, or they don't have agency, or they don't have the resource. And then so it involves going back up to the top again, and it's the cycle of sort of top-down pressure. I sense that the advent of generative AI has been an accelerant and has woken people up a little bit, but I'd love to hear what you're seeing in the space on a sort of ongoing basis.
Well, I hear and see the same things. It's very difficult when you get down to a newsroom where, just publishing the paper every day or publishing the website every day is the priority. If something else comes into the ecosystem, I mean, when we founded Storyful, that was about solving what seemed 15 years ago an unsolvable problem. How do you verify user-generated content? It's coming from everywhere. Well, 15 years ago, the answer to that question was find the original version. If you can find the original version really quickly, you have a much, much better chance of verifying it and rights clearing it, and then that content being turned into usable journalism. So the idea that originality, authenticity, provenance is important is already baked in. I think the key is, as I said, is to take it from what I would call a sort of embrace the problem and manage the opportunity, to switch it around and turn it into a positive thing where you are embracing the opportunity of this technology. I'm well known for saying you should use technology before it uses you, right? And this is an opportunity for the news industry to take what you guys have built, what all of these incredible tech companies have built, and recognize the value to them now, get prepared now for what those protocols can mean for them in a world where already, and certainly in a few years' time, anybody who's consuming the New York Times or CNN or anybody else, unless you're a super fan and coming to their website, they're going to be seeing this content in an ocean of AI-generated information and content. Content credentials is an incredibly important part, along with other things, of marking your territory. This, if you want authenticated, verified information, come here. And I do think that the answer is going to be slightly different in each publisher. They might want different applications of CR in different places. But I'm using CR already. Do you hear that? That's CR. That's content credentials. That I think there might be different applications of it and maybe different branded versions of it. But I do think that people are changing their minds. I think that people are beginning to think about this. And just like it was with Storyful, you need ninjas. You need the people in the newsrooms who get it and then have the ability to actually put it in place.
Right.
And those are there. Those people are there.
And the stakes, it seems to me, have never been higher. I mean, 2024 is going to be a seminal year for democracy around the world. Over 2 billion people are going to be voting in over 50 elections. And as we've heard earlier today, we're already starting to see whether it's generative AI content or other manipulated content creep into campaigns around mis and disinformation as it relates to elections. That, for me, is incredibly concerning and worrisome. In addition, unfortunately, we have 2 major conflicts raging in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and we're seeing mis and disinformation being generated from those conflicts. So do you sense, David, that perspective of urgency because of those things, those world events coming and ongoing, as well as the technology, is waking people up? Are you getting a sense that these, it's always struck me in the news media business, no organization is faster when it comes to getting to the scene of breaking news and telling the story and generating content, but sometimes no organizations are slower than news media organizations because they have so much on their plates.
Well, I think one main reason that the news industry and journalism has been slow to respond and act is a kind of a paralysis. And that paralysis is based on two things. First of all, journalists are notoriously egotistic and believe that they are the arbiters of information and the interlocutors. They are the ones, the gatekeepers, if you want to put it that way. And I reject all of that, but I do recognize as a former journalist that journalists don't like to think that a tech solution or a piece of technology protocol is going to be any better than their journalism. I wrote the article, read the bloody article, and that's all you need to know, right? And the change that I see happening is that journalists are recognizing, as they see job cuts, as they see AI threatening their jobs, that it is not good enough anymore to just assume that audiences understand what the value of journalism is, and they need all of the help that they can get. So there is a recognition, I think, that technology can help, and that's what I'm talking about embrace the opportunity. I think that is there. And I also think that beyond the newsrooms, in the audiences and people who are consuming news, I do think that there is a risk that people are going to just stop caring. But I do think that there is an opportunity right now, particularly in the next year or two, that if recognizable, understandable processes and frameworks are put in place, that people will recognize the value of them, that audiences are craving that. They want authentic information. Although I do think that there's a semantic question because, fake news has been abused as a term for years now. Authenticity can mean different things for different people. I do think that content credentials is actually a very clever set of semantic structure for what we're trying to talk about. Because if you think about what credentials are, I could see your credentials if you're a cop who stopped me for speeding, and I still don't like you because I don't want to get a ticket for speeding, but I recognize that your credentials give you the right to issue that ticket to me, right? And I think credentials is a really smart way to think about this. Credentials is less likely to be politicized or abused in that way, as long as it is recognized the way you guys have structured it with this framework as something that gives you the information that you need to decide what you want out of the information that you're being given. Does it mean that you completely believe it? That's up to you. But it's kind of an equalized, leveled approach to the background information. If you want the forensic details, they're there. If you want the surface level provenance, it's there. And you can look at that and still make your decision, but you're not automatically looking at it and assuming it's true or not true. And I think audiences crave that. And that goes back to newsrooms. Newsrooms are looking at their audiences saying, tell us how we can help you trust us. And this helps audiences trust news organizations.
Right, right. So despite being called Santiago, I happen to be raised in Ireland. And as you might have noticed, David is Irish. And so like any erstwhile Irishman, we were sharing a pint of Guinness the other day in a pub, or three. David, you were telling me something fascinating about the relationship between media companies and large language models.
Yep.
And some work that's going on. And I know some of it's sensitive, but I wonder if you could just give this audience an overview, because I think there's a relationship, a definite relationship between news media companies, LLMs, Provenance.
Yes. Well, I can actually tell you quite a lot. I mean, I act as, in some ways, along with a number of other people, as an interlocutor between tech companies and the news industry, or I help advise on both sides of the equation. And there is a very active conversation going on right now about whether AI companies should pay or license access to news content. And the answer is yes, they should, right? But one of the issues is that, apart from any financial aspects, that bots are an incredibly inefficient way to access content of any kind, and they are a specifically terrible way to access news content because you're looking at websites and paywalls and aggregated content and everything else. So we're working on a solution that if and when deals go into place, that there would be an off-site solution so that only original content original journalism content, is stored in a database and accessed directly. You get all of the information, all with value scoring, all tethered back to its original place, and none of the scraping or inaccuracies that are involved in that. So working on that and that conversation has also revealed the fact to me that provenance and authenticity connect to value in a way that I think if we together can help the news industry understand that things like provenance and authenticity help them make the argument to OpenAI, to Microsoft, to Google, that they can show the value of their content, that it's not just one article is the same as the other, that provenance and authenticity marking will actually be much, much more valuable to news organizations and to tech companies if it maintains that provenance and that history and that story of each piece of content. So if you're negotiating billions of dollars, maybe more, in negotiations, any tool like this is actually not just something which the boss says, hey, we should think about doing this at some point. It becomes urgently needed because pretty soon you're going to need to put your content in a place where an AI large language machine is going to come and look at the content for its for the purposes of AI, but at some point there'll be a value exchange, right? At that point, the value exchange that includes authenticity and provenance, and obviously branding and all of those other things, is going to be vitally important. So I'm, journalists are egotistical. The bosses on the news industry have their eyes clearly focused on survival and making money, and anything that helps in that value exchange is very important.
But how does that licensing model work? In other words, if I'm a media company and I'm willing to license my content to an OpenAI or another LLM, because when you go on those things, you go on ChatGPT, for example, and it'll say, this information reflects data that was scraped up to a certain point.
Yes.
It's not time sensitive, but news obviously is.
Right. Well, it is, and the conceit of AI and large language models has been, well, we don't need fresh content. We just need to train our models. Well, that's, I'm not more sure what word I can use, but that's not true. Because if you are really trying to, they're in a problem that they're replacing their own existing business, which is search, right? And search is very close to real time and does recognize news and fresh information. Well, if you're developing AI tools and then suddenly they don't do real time and they don't recognize updated information, and if, as is the case right now, every single major news organization got the memo from OpenAI and from Google of here's how you block our bots, every single one of them said, thank you very much, we're blocking your bots. They're blocked right now, right? And if you are building tools that you want consumers to use as AI tools and you don't have any access to fresh information for now and for years, months in the past, people won't use those tools, certainly won't use them for news. And so there is a recognition by AI companies that they face the problem of shit in, shit out, right? They have to harness the power of news and journalism in some way. And they recognize that they kind of got away with it for 30 years on search, and now they're agreeing to pay even for that. I think people are motivated on both sides to get it right this time. Doesn't mean it'll be the amount of money that news companies want. Doesn't mean that everybody will get what they want. But I do think there's a recognition. So therefore, when you are talking about value exchange, a Wall Street Journal article is not worth the same as a generic AP article. They're both worth something, but anything and everything that can tie content credentials, analytics that already exist about content and where it came from, all of those things contribute to that value exchange. And all of that can be done in real time. And so it's really just sort of getting past the argument about whether they should be paying or not and starting to talk about how that will function and really work for both sides.
Right. And we know that media companies are always hungry for new revenue streams because the advertising industry sort of fell out of the bottom of that. So it sounds very encouraging. When we look at the landscape around trust and authenticity, we identified on the CAI team 4 main areas. The area of detection, which we're not focused on for reasons that I think have been mentioned. It's not scalable. It's an arms race. It's not particularly accurate. So we're not involved in detection per se. But the 3 other areas that we are involved in, one is policy and working with policymakers around the world to make sure that they're well informed as to the status quo of technology as well as what's coming. And that's important because legislation, at least around generative AI, seems to be directionally headed towards mandated transparency, hence the value of the work that we're doing. That's all being underpinned by the C2PA and the CAI tools. The next area that we look at is the area of education. And in education, we can sort of split that into, one is classroom education. We've created a bunch of free curricular materials around media literacy for middle schoolers, high schoolers, and university students. But the other aspect of education, I think, as it relates to the news media, and I'd like to hear your views on this, is consumer education.
Yeah.
How do you get the word out? How do media companies get the word out? Is it individually? Is it collectively? Is it both? What are the tools there?
Well, it's a huge problem, but potentially opportunity. I think one of the things, going back to my point about how journalists and news companies have often just taken for granted that people understand the process and therefore understand the value, it's really become very important. And I think if you watch television news, that I still do, even though I'm not in that business anymore, if you watch television news, you will see a lot more news companies and journalists showing you the process, showing you what their crews did. If you look at the New York Times, for instance, former Storyful people are now working there doing forensic digital investigations that are winning Pulitzer Prizes. And I'm incredibly proud that the process that we started 15 years ago is now being used for that. But that is a perfect example. Forensics is the process, right? And if you bring people in, you would be surprised. I hope you wouldn't be surprised, but I am constantly surprised how much people really, users, consumers, really lean into that. They love to see the complexity of journalism. They like to understand the dangers and all of the layers that go into creating content. And so I think the first part of it is that news organizations themselves need to help their audiences understand more about what they do and how they do it. And the other part of it is that I think it's not just media literacy anymore. AI literacy is something that's going to become incredibly important going forward. And those two work together. And that is, again, I think if we wait too long, if you wait 5, 6 years, people will just give up. They won't, it'll be too late to educate people. But I do think that there's a moment, particularly in this next year or two, where audiences very much across the political spectrum and social spectrum are really just asking, help me, help us understand what it is that we should be looking at. And sometimes the answer, by the way, is look at less. Right? Sometimes AI literacy and media literacy is don't consume so much content, because if you just consume everything all the time, you're probably going to get stressed and worried. I often advise people, particularly in news, to have a pretty slim diet of news, because more is not necessarily better. So media literacy and AI literacy are important. And I think the news industry can be partners in that, because I think as they're trying to tell their story, as they're trying to show their importance in society, they would be willing allies with technology companies to say, we're going to show you what we do and how we do it, and then we're going to show you how content credentials and processes like that are things that you're going to start seeing. You're going to start seeing this logo, CR, you're going to start seeing it out there. We want to help you understand what it is and how it connects not just to some technical buzzword, but to really, truly meaningful processes that support you as a consumer understanding what's going on in the world. And I think, what Leica did and others about showing how it works for camera in the field all the way through to publication, I can see news companies being interested in partnering about, how their process and the risks and costs that they have connect to the technical protocols.
Right. We've spent a lot of time in the last couple of months thinking about the sort of the brand architecture, if you like, because there's still a little bit of confusion out there. What's C2PA versus CAI versus CR? And the way that we've been thinking about that has been, the C2PA is obviously the very robust, best-in-class, gold standard, open standard organization, quasi-invisible because of its deep technical nature, sitting within the Linux Foundation. Great. The CAI, the Content Authenticity Initiative, is the movement. It's the community of members pulling together to work together, to learn from each other, and it's also the builder of the open source tools that facilitate the implementation of the open standard. And then the content credentials, we spun up a new website the other day, contentcredentials.org, that's the product, if you like, the implementation. And when I think about those things as it relates to a call to action, especially around news media and for the journalists and others in the room who are involved with journalism, my call to action to all of you is to make noise in your newsrooms. Talk about what you're reading and hearing in the provenance space. Escalate it to your managers and to your leadership. And for those newsroom leaders in the room, push your business folks and your technology folks to work together to implement this. That's my big call to action to all of you. What would your call to action be?
I completely agree, Santi. I think that it is not good enough for the news industry or the tech industry to sort of work away behind the scenes and not be really lighting a fire here. This is urgent. It's incredibly important. It's, you know, it could be existential for the news industry if authenticity is not fixed part, a pole of the way in which the role of journalism is understood in society. If that is lost, if authenticity doesn't mean anything anymore, that's, you know, why would people consume journalism? And so it's really incredibly important that every single one of us, and I certainly do this, light a fire under people. But I also think that it is important not to panic, and it is really important to make sure that when we're talking about the intersection of technology and journalism, for instance, that we also recognize that there's a much broader world now of creators, of people who are outside of the realm of journalism, who are creating information, passing it on. My adult kids consume news in all sorts of platforms that are not traditional news organizations. And I think that there's an incredibly important role for things like content credentials across that entire spectrum, because it's a combination of tools and teach and tools, right? You need to teach people. You need to teach newsrooms, you need to teach audiences, you need to teach consumers about what AI is, about what, you know, journalism is. You need to teach them, but you also need to show them where the tools are. If these websites are only ever used by a few people, that's not good enough, right? These tools need to be broadly available. People need to be able to understand. My mother-in-law sent me an image. You know, how the hell do I know if it's true? The awareness is one part, that you shouldn't trust anything. And again, I'm famous. Don't trust anything you see online, including yourself, because your own biases will mislead you. But if you know that, and then you also have access to tools that quickly allow you to drop an image in and check its origin, maybe not to the forensic level that a photographer needs, but at least to know that it's real and where it came from. So teaching and tools are the combination that I think is incredibly important.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're done. We're out of time. Thank you all very much. And
That's great.